Something strange happened in the gold and silver market this week, and almost nobody explained it correctly. On Wednesday, gold jumped more than 4% in a single session. Silver jumped even harder, over 6%. By Friday, gold was pushing toward $4,600 an ounce, and silver had cleared $69, capping one of the strongest weeks either metal has had all year. Most headlines called it a flight to safety. Some called it inflation fear. A few called it dollar weakness. All of those explanations are partly true. None of them are the real story. Because the actual catalyst behind this move didn't come from a war, a crash, or a surprise inflation report. It came from a memo, a quiet, technical announcement from the United States Treasury Department about how it plans to buy back its own debt. And if you understand what that memo actually means, and why it's colliding with something the Federal Reserve is doing at almost the exact same time, you'll understand something about the next few months in gold and silver that most casual investors are going to miss completely. If you're interested in money, investing, gold, silver, the economy, and protecting your financial future, go ahead and subscribe to Money Insiders and like this video while you're at it. We break down the financial stories that matter in plain English, without the jargon and without the hype. Because what's happening in the metals market right now genuinely affects people who don't own a single ounce of gold. Here's why this matters, even if you've never bought a coin or a bar in your life. Gold and silver aren't just collectibles for preppers and hobbyists anymore. They sit inside retirement accounts, pension funds, and central bank reserves. They move in relationship to interest rates, which move in relationship to your mortgage, your savings account, and the price of everything you buy. When gold and silver move sharply and together, it's usually because something is shifting underneath the financial system that hasn't fully shown up in the headlines yet. Workers watching their 401k, retirees living off fixed income, homeowners wondering if rates are going up or down, small business owners trying to plan for next year, all of them have a stake in this, whether they realize it or not. So let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence matters. On Wednesday, the Treasury Department announced it would roughly double the size of its buyback operations for longer-dated government bonds, moving up to $4 billion per operation starting in early September. Now, if you've never heard the term buyback in this context, here's what it actually means in plain English. When the government wants to manage how much it costs to borrow money over long periods, it can go into the market and repurchase some of its older, less liquid bonds. Doing this in large enough size tends to push the price of those bonds up, and when bond prices go up, the yield, which is essentially the return an investor earns for holding that bond, goes down. So a bigger buyback operation is one of the tools the Treasury has to quietly push long-term borrowing costs lower without the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates at all. That's the mechanical explanation. But here's the detail that changes the picture. Look at what happened in the operation that came right before this announcement. The Treasury offered to buy roughly $20 billion worth of long-term bonds. Dealers only sold them about $2 billion. That was the smallest response of any comparable buyback operation this year. In other words, this wasn't a case of the Treasury stepping in because sellers were flooding the market and yields were spiraling out of control. There was no flood. The selling queue wasn't getting longer, it was actually shrinking. Which means doubling the buyback size wasn't a reaction to distress, it was a decision. A deliberate signal delivered days after the 30-year Treasury yield touched its highest level since 2007, that the government intends to hold down long-term borrowing costs, whether the bond market cooperates naturally or not. Now here's where the story gets more interesting, and where the title of this video actually starts to make sense. At the exact same moment the Treasury was moving to cap long-term yields, the Federal Reserve, under its new chair, Kevin Warsh, has been doing something close to the opposite. Warsh took over as Fed chair in May of this year, and his early tenure has been defined by a notably hawkish tone on inflation. At his very first meeting in June, 9 of the 18 Federal Reserve officials penciled in at least one interest rate hike for later in 2026, a dramatic shift from where projections stood just months earlier. At his second meeting in July, 3 regional Fed presidents formally dissented in favor of raising rates immediately, the widest three-way split the committee has seen in years. Warsh himself has declined to submit his own personal rate projection, which some analysts read as a deliberate move to keep markets from anchoring to his individual view. The committee, in other words, is hawkish. The chairman is intentionally hard to read, and the market has been left trying to reconcile two institutions that appear to be pulling in different directions at the same time. So ask yourself the obvious question. Why would the Treasury Department work to push long-term borrowing costs down while the Federal Reserve is actively signaling it might raise short-term rates to fight inflation? That tension between the Treasury and the Fed is not a minor technical footnote. It is arguably the single most important undercurrent in the gold and silver market right now, more important than any individual headline about a surging gold price. Because when the government's own debt managers start actively suppressing long-term yields at a moment when the national debt has just crossed $40 trillion, some analysts and market commentators have started describing that as a step toward what's sometimes called fiscal dominance. That's a term worth explaining plainly, because it sounds academic, but it isn't. It refers to a situation where the sheer size of government debt starts to influence or even constrain what the central bank can realistically do with interest rates, because raising rates too aggressively would make the cost of servicing that debt overwhelming. Whether that's fully what's happening here is genuinely uncertain, and responsible analysts are careful not to overstate it. But the fact that Warsh himself has reportedly floated the idea of a new formal understanding between the Treasury and the Fed, similar to historical accords that have defined the boundary between fiscal and monetary policy in the past, tells you this tension is being discussed seriously inside the system, not just by outside commentators. Here's what this actually means for someone watching this video who has never thought about bond buybacks in their life. When real yields, meaning interest rates adjusted for inflation, come down because of Treasury intervention rather than because inflation itself is falling, it changes the calculation for holding an asset like gold that pays no interest or dividend at all. Gold's biggest disadvantage as an investment has always been the same thing. It just sits there. It doesn't generate income the way a bond or a dividend stock does. So when interest rates are high, the opportunity cost of holding gold instead of an interest-bearing asset goes up, and gold tends to struggle. But when real yields fall, that opportunity cost shrinks, and gold becomes relatively more attractive. That's the mechanical reason a Treasury-driven drop in long-term yields, even without any change from the Fed, can send gold and silver higher almost immediately. It's exactly what happened this week. A weaker dollar amplified the move further because gold and silver are priced in dollars globally, so a softer dollar makes them cheaper for foreign buyers and adds additional fuel to the rally. But this is where a lot of retail investors stop paying attention, and that's a mistake, because there's another layer to this story that deserves a closer look. While everyone was reacting to this week's price spike, a much slower and arguably more important trend has been building quietly for over a year, and it has almost nothing to do with day-to-day price action. Central banks around the world have been buying gold at a pace that outsiders in the market frequently underestimate. In the second quarter of this year alone, central banks purchased roughly 289 metric tons of gold, a quarterly record, and they did this even as gold's price was falling sharply from its January peak. Think about what that actually tells you. Central banks are not day traders. They don't buy an asset because the chart looks good this week. For a central bank, gold functions as a long-term structural reserve, not a short-term position. When the price falls, that's not a reason for them to panic and sell. It's viewed internally as an opportunity to accumulate more of the same asset at a cheaper price. Poland's central bank led the buying, adding 51 tons in the second quarter alone, pushing toward a publicly stated goal of holding 700 tons in reserve. China's central bank added 33 tons, its largest single-quarter purchase since late 2023, extending a buying streak that some reporting has placed at over 20 consecutive months, with reported holdings near 2,300 tons. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Jordan, and the Czech Republic also added meaningfully to their reserves. Now, here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you, and it's one of the most important numbers in this entire story. According to recent market commentary, central banks around the world are now believed to collectively hold more gold in their reserves than they hold in U.S. Treasury securities, with the dollar's share of global reserves sliding toward roughly 54%. If that trend is accurate and continues, it represents a structural shift in how the world's biggest financial institutions think about safety and reserves, a shift that has been building gradually since well before this week's price spike. This is the part where the story widens beyond just gold and silver as commodities and starts to look like a much bigger conversation about confidence in government debt itself, confidence in currencies, and how the institutions that manage the world's money are quietly repositioning, even as ordinary headlines focus on day-to-day price swings. But here's the reality check, because this video isn't here to tell you gold and silver are guaranteed to keep climbing, and any channel that tells you that isn't being straight with you. The technical picture is genuinely mixed, and it's worth walking through both sides fairly. Gold is still down roughly 28% from its January record high, near $5,600 an ounce. And by some technical measures, that decline meets the common definition of a bear market. Weekly momentum indicators have been pointing lower for weeks, and gold's relative strength index, a measurement of how overbought or oversold an asset is, recently touched its lowest level since late 2023. Silver's story is even more dramatic. It went from around $40 an ounce in September of last year to an extraordinary $116 in January, a move of nearly 190% in just a few months, before falling back down toward the $50 range by summer. That kind of parabolic move followed by a sharp pullback is a pattern that shows up repeatedly throughout market history, and it doesn't automatically mean the bull run is over, but it also doesn't mean it's guaranteed to continue. Some analysts, including forecasters at major institutions like JP Morgan, have actually revised their silver price targets downward this year from an earlier average forecast near $84 down to around $70, citing the risk that higher interest rates could reduce the appeal of holding a non-yielding asset like silver. Other analysts remain far more bullish, with some technical forecasts suggesting a path back toward $150 for silver and $7,000 for gold if key resistance levels break. The honest answer is that both scenarios are being taken seriously by credible people, and nobody can tell you with certainty which one plays out. There's also a structural piece of the silver story worth understanding because it's different from gold in an important way. Silver isn't just a monetary metal, it's an industrial one, used heavily in solar panel manufacturing and electronics. That gives silver what analysts call higher beta relative to gold, meaning its price swings tend to be amplified in both directions compared to gold's moves. When gold rallies, silver often rallies harder. When gold falls, silver often falls harder too. That relationship shows up clearly in something called the gold to silver ratio, which measures how many ounces of silver it takes to buy a single ounce of gold. That ratio dropped below 45 in January, an unusually low level that reflected silver's explosive outperformance before climbing back up toward the high 60s and low 70s as silver cooled off faster than gold did. Right now, positioning data shows that speculative traders are historically underexposed to silver, sitting near the bottom 20% of activity levels over the past 60 weeks. Some analysts interpret that as evidence that silver isn't broken as an investment thesis. It's simply unowned at the moment, which is a very different story than a market that's lost conviction entirely. There's one more piece of the silver puzzle that rarely gets mentioned, and it's the kind of detail that separates a surface-level explanation from a genuinely useful one. Earlier this year, India, which is one of the largest physical silver markets on Earth, imposed new licensing requirements on silver imports in an effort to protect its foreign exchange reserves. For roughly 6 months, shipments into the country effectively stopped. Imports have only recently restarted, with traders bringing in close to 90 tons through August alone, and roughly 400 tons of licenses now approved. But here's the overlooked detail. The number that actually matters isn't the volume of silver moving into India. It's the premium buyers there are willing to pay above the world futures price to actually get their hands on physical metal. When a large, price-sensitive market like India is still paying up to secure real silver even after the futures price has fallen sharply. That tells you something the headline price alone can't. The price you see quoted on a screen and the price it actually costs to obtain physical metal in the real world are two different things, and right now, that gap is wider than usual. It's a reminder that a chart showing silver's futures price falling from its January peak doesn't necessarily mean physical demand for the metal has fallen by the same amount. Now let's make this concrete, because none of this matters much if it stays abstract. Picture someone in their early 60s with a retirement account split between stocks, bonds, and a small allocation to gold they added a couple of years ago as a hedge. When the Treasury pushes long-term yields down through buybacks, the bonds in that portfolio may see their prices rise modestly, which sounds good on paper. But if that yield decline is happening alongside inflation that hasn't fully cooled, the real inflation-adjusted return on the safe portion of that portfolio can still be shrinking even as account balances look stable. That's exactly the environment where a small allocation to gold has historically been designed to do its job, cushioning the portfolio precisely when bonds alone can't fully protect purchasing power. Now picture a younger family carrying a mortgage. If Warsh's Jackson Hole speech leans dovish and the Fed ultimately holds off on a September hike, mortgage-linked rates that track the same long end of the bond market the Treasury is targeting could ease further. A modest but real benefit for anyone refinancing or buying a home later this year. If the speech leans hawkish instead, that relief could stall out. Neither outcome is guaranteed, but understanding the mechanism means you're not just watching a number change, you're watching the actual channel through which that number affects your own finances. So where does all of this leave the original question? What did gold and silver's move this week actually signal, and what happens next? The most defensible answer, based on the verified evidence, is that the metals market is currently caught between two competing forces that are both real and both significant. On one side, you have a Treasury Department actively working to hold down long-term borrowing costs at a moment when the national debt has crossed $40 trillion, a decision some analysts read as an early sign of the kind of fiscal pressure that has historically supported gold over long periods. On the other side, you have a Federal Reserve Chair who has spent his first months in office deliberately hawkish on inflation, withholding forward guidance, and overseeing a committee with an unusually wide internal split about whether rates need to go higher. Layered underneath both of those forces is the slower, steadier trend of central banks around the world quietly accumulating gold regardless of short-term price swings, a trend that doesn't care about this week's headline and has been building for well over a year. All of that tension is about to collide at a single specific moment that every serious trader in this market is watching closely. The Federal Reserve's annual Jackson Hole Symposium runs from August 27th through the 29th, and on the 28th, Kevin Warsh will deliver his very first keynote address as Fed chair. This matters more than it might sound like it should, because history shows Jackson Hole speeches have repeatedly reshaped markets within hours. When former Fed Chair Jerome Powell used the platform in 2022 to warn about the economic pain required to bring down inflation, stocks fell sharply within that same trading session. When Powell shifted to a more accommodating tone in 2024, signaling that the time had come to ease policy, markets rallied just as quickly in the opposite direction. Surveys currently show that a majority of fund managers expect Warsh to strike a neutral tone this time, avoiding a direct signal about the Fed's September rate decision. But that expectation itself is exactly what creates the risk. When a market has already priced in a neutral, uneventful speech, even a modest surprise in either direction, a phrase that reads as more hawkish or more dovish than expected, has the potential to move gold, silver, the dollar, and bond yields sharply within minutes. The Fed's next rate decision arrives on September 16th, and market-implied odds of a rate hike have already swung dramatically over the past month from around 60% down toward roughly 1 in 3, as recent economic data, including a surprising contraction in July hiring and cooler than expected inflation readings, gave the Fed more room to hold steady rather than tighten further. What this means, practically, is that the single most important piece of new information in this entire story hasn't even happened yet. Everything discussed up to this point, the Treasury's buyback decision, the central bank buying trend, the technical pullback in both metals, the shifting rate hike odds, all of it sets the stage for a speech that could either confirm the current cautious optimism in gold and silver or completely upend it within a single afternoon. If you learned something new today, make sure to subscribe to Money Insiders and like this video. More powerful financial insights are coming next. This video is AI generated.